السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. طبتم وطابت أوقاتكم بكل خير أينما كنتم، وأهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه الندوة الافتراضية بعنوان الشهادات المصغرة المتتابعة في التعليم العام والعالي. وأسعدنا زيد بن علي الرقيب بتقديمها لكم نيابة عن المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني من مدينة الرياض بالمملكة العربية السعودية. نحيطكم علما بأن الترجمة الفورية متاحة باللغة العربية لهذه الجلسة. الرجاء الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة في أسفل الشاشة. Greetings from the city of Riyadh, capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm Zaid Al-Raqib. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center, we welcome you all to this webinar on stackable micro-credentials in K-12 and higher education. It is with great privilege that we welcome Professor Kevin Ashford Rowe, Pro Vice Chancellor, Learning and Teaching at Queensland University of Technology, who will be the host for this session. We also welcome the distinguished panelists, Dr. Donna Harvey, Deputy Principal at Binlay High School, and Ms. Margot Griffith, Co-Chair at Queensland Micro-Credential Community of Practice. We would like to thank these distinguished speakers for joining us today. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to the host, Professor Ashford Rowe.
Thank you, Zaid, and thank you very much to the NELC for extending this invitation, and for those colleagues and participants who've joined us. We're going to, myself, Margot and Donna, are going to move through 3 areas of presentation, talk about stackable micro-credentials very much in the Australian context, touch a little bit on the broader international context, and then I think we're very happy to take questions. So I think what we might do is move straight into the session, and Donna is driving our presentation, so we might go to the next slide, please, Donna. Sorry, Donna, Margot is driving the presentation. Thank you, Margot. So as I said, today in the program, a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges of developing a micro-credential strategy in higher education from my experience predominantly in my current place of work. Donna is going to talk about designing micro-credentials for equity in the K-12 setting, particularly focusing on her work from Binlay State High School. And then Margot is going to talk about a twin-track strategy of learning architecture and open link data through intentional design. And then we'll take some time for questions afterwards. And what I'm hoping is that as we move through these presentations, you'll see that there is joined up thinking in what it is that we're doing, but also there are still gaps and challenges in what is effectively a comparatively new form of delivering education, at least in a formal sense. So we might go to the next slide, please, Margot. So in reflecting on micro-credentials, and I think it's worth thinking about this more broadly, because I think this is one of the big questions, particularly in a higher education context. And there is emerging literature, or there is significant literature on the ways in which micro-credentials and the disaggregation of the formal award is challenging the paradigms and what we know about delivering education in a more traditional context. So I think that organizationally, whether it's from an organizational perspective or whether it's from a broader perspective of a specific institution, or even a larger area or an entity, you really need to think about that, what I call the bigger picture. What are micro-credentials to you, and why are you interested in them? And is it that, as I've framed it there, you want to go down that disaggregated qualification path, or do you want to institutionally remain on the expert-created and 3-4 year developmental narrative that you get from a traditional award course? And I think it's important that we understand this and don't lose sight of that, because there is a fear that I hold that we could be rushed headlong into micro-credentials and the breaking up and disaggregation of the educational experience and the re-aggregation of it. As a former colleague of mine, Alf Litzio, used to put it, but the reaggregation from the perspective of an individual. And very often, of course, individuals elect to study at institutions such as ours because they want that 3 to 4 year curated, created developmental narrative that comes from the traditional award course that takes you from a first year undergraduate to a third or fourth year graduate. And I've put there nursing and teaching. My university is a big nurse educator and teacher training university. But it is important that you understand that the challenge, I think, for many of us is not that we will change from those bigger courses, but we have to think about how these disaggregated and scaffolded entities, stackable entities fit in to that. Next slide, please, Margot. So if you have made the decision that you are interested in micro-credentials and you want to pursue micro-credentials, I think that there are a couple of key things at the very outset that you need to determine. And the main one is whether or not you are delivering micro-credentials that are for credit or not for credit. Now here, you move into the conversation about micro-credentials and badges and different levels of offering. But if you are going to create offerings, micro-credentials that are stackable, then they probably are going to achieve some form of credit. And that means it's likely that they're going to be assessed. And if they are going to be assessed, how are they going to be assessed? And if you are going to assess the achievement of a micro-credential, then you probably need to predicate it on some form of a curriculum or a syllabus with an assessment regime that's quality assured. And to that end, who is it in your organization or entity that provides that expert sign-off on that curriculum? And then how and where the credit's stored, and how are credits accredited against other awards when organizations, when individuals want to seek to stack them and claim them against other awards, particularly as that moves through various sectors of the education and training system. Next slide, please, Margot. So then if they're not for credit, what is their purpose and how is it defined? Is it that you're seeking to fill a skills gap? And there is certainly reports and literature, again, that talks in the Australian context about how employers feel that students from the education system, from the higher education system, are not being properly prepared for the workplace. And there is a sense that we have skills gaps that we need to fill before they're properly equipped. This is a bigger conversation, of course, insofar as, again, I go back to the literature and people like Gavin Moody, who will tell us that many years ago, employers actually took the responsibility for taking graduates from an education system and filling that training and skills gap themselves. But increasingly, that's being put back on to education providers. So if, as many universities in Australia are doing, is using micro-credentials that are not necessarily assessed as a means of closing that skills gap, then you have, again, a range of considerations. Are these micro-credentials, are they credentialed in the form of a badge? I might just go back one slide, please, Margot. And if they are, again, is there a curriculum and a syllabus, and is it quality assured, and who's providing the expert sign off on that? And then how and where the badge is stored so that they can be easily accessed and passed between systems. Next slide, please, Margot. So whichever way you go, I think that you do have to have in place some form of a policy framework and some form of a digital ecosystem that can deliver, award, and track micro-credentials and badges, and then pass them, that is their metadata, between systems, sectors, and jurisdictions. And Margot, I think, will be touching on much more of this in much more detail with her work. Next slide, please. So at QUT, we are an Australian public funded university. We're one of about 40 public funded universities in Australia. We have approximately 50,000 students, predominantly undergraduate, but with a strong postgraduate by research and postgraduate by coursework cohorts. We're located across 2 physical campuses in Brisbane, in Queensland, about halfway down the eastern coast of Australia. And we also have what we call our 3rd campus, which is our digital campus. So we have had extensive experience in the use of MOOCs, and I think it's fair to say that an awful lot of the conversation around micro-credentials seems to have come out of the work and the conversations that occurred around MOOCs. For us, it's FutureLearn. I know that in an ELC, you offer micro-credentials through your own provider, FutureX, which has a relationship, I believe, with CourseX, edX, FutureLearn again, and Udacity to offer a range of flexible learning pathways. But one of the things that we've done with our MOOC provider in FutureLearn is worked with them to work out whether there are ways that we can take the MOOC offering and break it up into smaller chunks that build progressively from a free, massively open online course that might move you to a smaller micro-credential and then a bigger micro-credential that hopefully stacks towards an award, and in our case, a master's. We also created an award to non-award micro-credential framework. We needed to establish this because institutionally, even within the context of our own institution, it was a little bit like the Wild West in that there were a number of departments and faculties going their own direction and doing their own things around micro-credentials. And we decided that we needed to have some kind of consistency, some kind of framework in place that helped us to define things like volume of learning, whether it was assessed or not assessed, whether it was credit bearing or otherwise. And from the basis of that, we've also continued to work with FutureLearn and Online Education Services, both of whom are owned by Seek Australia, which is a major recruitment organization. And with FutureLearn, as I'm sure that you'll be aware from your own work, we've had to work to that European standard. So it's interesting in that a number of jurisdictions are bringing about their own standards, and we're having to think about how we map within all of those. And we might go to the next slide, please, Margot. Those are just some sources and resources that might provide a little bit more interesting background reading to some of what I've had to say. And I know we've been recorded, so hopefully those will be available to you later on. And the next slide, please, Margot. So one of the things that we came to realize, this was in conversations I had with Margot, and Margot had links with Queensland TAFE, which is our further education provider, that there were a number of us who were all providing our own micro-credentialing or award to non-award frameworks, and we were all providing them and developing them and designing them independently. And we felt that there would be value in seeing if there was interest in pulling together a few people who were involved in this conversation to see whether or not a true community of practice was out there. And we've been going now for about 2 years. We probably have around 20 or so members, give or take. We have a number of universities in Queensland, and we have TAFE Queensland, who are the further education provider. We have a state high school who you're going to be hearing from soon in the form of Beenleigh State High School. We've got industry representatives and community representatives. We have a representative from the Scouts movement in Australia who also represents a number of those other community organisations. And we have the Defence Force, and we have our own tertiary QTAC, which is the Queensland Tertiary Admissions Centre, which is the clearinghouse for universities. And one of the things that we've sought to do that have kind of grown organically out of this community of practice is some cross-sector projects and pathways. And this has been very interesting work, because what we found is that there is real appetite within the community to think about how you might take and devise a micro-credential And I believe that for the purposes of this exercise, some of the colleagues in the community of practice took digital literacy as a potential micro-credential. I thought about how it could be mapped across from the school system through the further education system and into the university systems. And it was an absolutely fascinating case study in how, when you take a student-centered perspective and you think about the use of micro-credentials to drive an education agenda, how powerfully you could create these kind of entities and these kind of pathways, which in effect are really creating the very stackable types of awards that we're talking about. And I might go to what I believe is my last slide, please, Margot. And what I'm going to do now is welcome Dr. Donna Harvey, who's the Deputy Principal of Beanley State High School, and invite Donna to share some of her work around this micro-credentialing framework that Beanley State High School have designed, developed, and are implementing. But just before I do that, one of the things I wanted to do was just talk about the importance of the letters SHS, State High School, because in Queensland, what that means is that it's a high school funded by the state. So it's not a private school. In fact, it's very much a public school in the sense that its resources and funding are from the government. So it's not a school of great wealth, and it's not a school that, neither is it a school that sits and works within a particularly wealthy area of Brisbane. In fact, Beanley, I lived near it for a number of years, is a wonderful place, but it's also wouldn't be considered somewhere that has high numbers of wealthy people living there. It's a low socioeconomic status area. It's also an area where the children who go to those schools are not necessarily enculturated from a home perspective to aspire to going further with their education. Higher education is universally available in Australia, but it's not universally always accessible because of some of the challenges that we have around cultural capital, for example. So this work resonates very strongly with me, but it's also very important because it's offering children from a particular area additional opportunities to showcase some of their talents and abilities that might not have existed for them otherwise. And with that, what I might do is hand over to you, Donna.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Margot, if I could just get you to move to the first slide, please. So just putting this in context in terms of what I'm about to speak to, as Kevin was saying, I work in a low socioeconomic area, Queensland, Australia. Our education system tends to prepare, and this would be replicated across the world, we tend to prepare our students for further studies rather than various types of employment. We tend to find that those employability skills are ensconced within all of our frameworks, our education curriculum, our syllabuses, but we don't tend to focus on them, and we certainly do not report on them. Now, the problem for a place like Beanley State High School is that 70% of our students opt to go straight into the workforce straight after school. So if you look at the World Economic Forum information, for instance, they're saying that 60% of future jobs haven't been developed yet, and 40% of kindergartners in schools today will need to be self-employed to have any form of income within the emerging gig economy. Instead of schools like ours at Beanley, we tend to be preparing our students for a defined career, a dream job that's probably not even going to be there within the next 5 to 10 years. So again, World Economic Forum is saying schools need to be preparing students for jobs that haven't been created yet. That creates a number of inequalities for our students, particularly those coming from low socioeconomic areas. So at Beanley State High School and a number of other schools around Australia, we basically sought to have a look at micro-credentials in soft skills. And by soft skills, we're talking about 21st century skills, employability skills, and how they might provide an opportunity for skill and knowledge development for an emerging workforce which will have to adapt to rapid change. We're now talking about the fourth industrial revolution. So just looking at that diagram down below there, we started up the top there with education innovation, looking at how micro-credentials could be such an education innovation in schools. We started to focus on the core soft skills, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later. We wanted to base it in our quality basic education. We weren't trying to turn our schooling system upside down. We just wanted to complement what we were already doing through those soft skill core skills. We wanted to make sure we were looking at lifelong learning pathways, because again, this is something that universities and further education focus on, but certainly we don't tend to focus on it a lot in our secondary education. Link that to relevant continuing education. And as Kevin was saying before, then we also brought in the digital literacies, and we'll talk about this in the sense of we have non-credit bearing, as Kevin was talking to, and we're now looking at this credit bearing micro-credential in digital literacies and the importance of STEM. Thank you, Margot. So one of our problems becomes that, and this is for all of us around the world in K-12 education, higher education in every country in the world is starting to look at or developing some form of micro-credential. And as I said, this is not mirrored in K-12 education. Now, for students who don't go on, as I said, most of my students don't go on to attend further education straight out of school. This is another disadvantage for them. As a result of, we tend to have a focus on learning subjects through memorization in secondary school. We have subject-based or maybe project-based topics in our schools. We learn those subjects through memorization. They're skills that are going to be easily supplanted in the fourth industrial revolution by AI. So we need to kind of rethink how we're doing that in schools. We have a limited understanding of the importance of soft skills. As I said, they're embedded in syllabuses and in curriculum, but we're not focusing on them. And again, that is worldwide. And also we find, as I said before, a reduced engagement in lifelong learning. It's investing in your own human capital is what I'm basically talking about. And I know at our school, for instance, a number of our students don't see that as important, where students coming from higher socioeconomic areas, it's kind of almost bred into them to be basically making sure you're constantly investing in yourself, in your own learning. Thank you, Margot. So I just want to share with you, this is an example of a grade 12 exit statement in the state of Queensland. Again, I want to go through all of those points singularly. So the first one, focus on learning subjects through memorization. So you can see there, we exit with a senior statement. There are all the subjects, as I said before, sitting there with a grade. And then over the other side, if you are successful in passing 5 of your 6 senior subjects, you get awarded a Queensland Certificate of Education, which really doesn't tell you very much about a student and their accomplishments or their capability at all. So these credentials are silent about a type of learning that is highly valued by employers and fundamental to future success in jobs and in life. Thank you, Margaret. The second point I spoke of before was this limited understanding of the importance of soft skills. So examples of what we're talking about here: problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration, teamwork, innovation, creativity, communication, and certainly personal management, such as resilience, and again, learning to learn, lifelong learning. When we again look at some of the World Economic Forum calculations, they're telling us that if we are to invest in our schools, and let's just take one, collaborative problem solving, they are telling us that the potential GDP gain from investment in that alone across areas in the world, and if you look at the pink dot there, that's where I'm situated, East Asia and the Pacific, for our economies, $330 billion, US billion dollars they're talking about. If you look at the Middle East, which is the green dot just down there on the left-hand side, the Middle East and North Africa, $266 billion to our economies, to our GDP, if we start focusing on these in our school environments. And this is now for the individual, Australian businesses are telling us that they would be willing to pay 7% more to the individual for workers with those soft skills. So hence the importance of us starting to focus on these within our schooling education systems. Thank you, Margaret. The last point there was reduced engagement in lifelong learning or learning to learn. Sorry, this is Australian data here from Alpha Beta and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I'll just talk you through this very quickly. So as you can see there in 2018, and it goes to 2040, they're basically looking at the total stock of labour force in millions of hours that we will undertake in our country in 2018 as opposed to 2040. You'll see there most education around the world, not just Australia, is still completed under the age of 21, which is the dark blue on both those graphs. That will still be the case it's lessening, but still be the case in 2040. But what I want to point out here is the increase in on-the-job learning and formal job training that will occur over that 22-year period of time. Still university in vet, and this is withstanding a population growth across all of our countries, but still you can appreciate if you're looking at the 19 billion hours of on-the-job learning in 2018 in Australia, which jumps to the expectation for the future workforce in 2040 is 121 billions of hours. Formal job training, 37 to 113. That's where we're going to see most of that increase. And as I said, are we training our secondary students to understand the importance of investing in their own development as they proceed through their careers? Thank you, Margot. So, based on that information, Beenleigh State High School, and as I said, a number of schools around Australia, started to reimagine our K-12 education to meet the 21st century needs, shaping a path from secondary education to employability and economic independence for our students. So that's why we decided to start exploring the use of micro-credentials to accredit clusters of those in-demand employability skills, soft skills, 21st century skills that I talked of before. Support a range of micro-credentials. Now, at the moment, I'm talking non-credit bearing micro-credentials, targeting priority industry skills. And in Australia, this could be contextualised around the world in different areas within different countries. For us, at the moment, that's trades, logistics, warehousing and logistics, aged care. They're sort of the industry skills that we need here in Southeast Queensland at the moment. So we can start to target those and prioritise those industry skills for our students. Enable employers and decision makers to meaningfully distinguish candidates with equal attainment. If you have a cert in, let's say, logistics and warehousing, there's a great range in a student who maybe just passes, it's pass or fail, who just passes that cert, as opposed to a student who basically is very high in terms of outcomes with that cert. So we want to make that obvious to our employers and decision makers. And finally here, work with, and this is now we're talking about credit-bearing micro-credentials, work with higher education providers to develop micro-credentials that allow students to receive recognition for prior learning at their institution. Effectively, in the words of Peter Drucker, what we were trying to do, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Thank you, Margot. So as Kevin talked about before, you have to start with an ecosystem. You have to kind of plan or plot what it is you're trying to achieve. So this was just a baseline of the employability skills, and this will change over time, that we felt we needed to focus on in Southeast Queensland for our students, and a range of industry skills, again, contextualised for Beenleigh State High School. You'll see there agriculture, poultry, junior judging, lead farm hand. We actually have a farm at our school. So again, you contextualise some of those skills for your students and your local environment. Thank you, Margaret. And now this is where, as Kevin, I'm bringing up what Kevin was talking about before, based on your local syllabuses, your own curriculum. So we started mapping. Schools in Southeast Queensland, Beenleigh started this. We mapped basically across all of our curriculum areas. There's national curriculum in here, there are state syllabuses in here, And we also use the OECD's 2030 future workforce because our students are going to be global. Let's face it, in terms of their future employment ability, they will be global, part of a global workforce. So this is what we came up with. It's a learning progression. We mark our students against this to issue non-credit bearing micro-credentials, and our learning progression goes from bronze to platinum. Everybody in the world understands that. Thank you, Margot. So then we decided we also wanted this to be digital. It's no good giving or presenting our students with a certificate at the end of grade 12. I can tell you now our students will lose that within the first month after graduating. So this actually sits on their phone. They can actually have this on a device and all those badges basically sit. We actually use the Credential platform, which is an international platform. And the benefit of the Credential platform for us is that it basically links our students to seek.com, which is, again, as I think before Kevin referred to seek.com, it's where we go to find our jobs and things like that. So it assists our students once they've left our school to find jobs. And then we also link all those non-credit badges to different courses at TAFE, Queensland TAFE, and also the universities in Queensland and around Australia. Thank you, Margot. Now, this is just not Australia. This is worldwide. So I'm actually looking here at an article that was actually published recently by Harvard University. So they're actually sort of discussing this with a number of schools in America. You can start to see the language starting to come through, though, in terms of what I talked about we're doing here in Australia and what Harvard is suggesting they do in schools in America. The language is slightly different in terms of we're calling them micro-credentials. They're calling them meso badges and macro badges. But down on the left-hand corner there, for example, you can see talking about at number 5, the student adds the meso badge to their badge portfolio. I just showed you our badge portfolio or our learner profile. And the new meso badge can be connected to additional meso badges to meet criteria for macro badges defined by standard setters and other entities such as employers and universities. Exactly the same thing that we're doing, just maybe using different language. It's already started over in Rhode Island schools, and they're giving an example here. And again, as you can see, same suite of employability skills that I was talking about: teamwork, communication, perseverance, problem solving, lifelong learning. And again, they're setting up rubrics to specify badge earning criteria, which is exactly what we've done at Beenleigh State High School. Thank you, Margot. This is I just wanted to give you an example. So as you go into our badges, and this is what Credential does for us. So it basically, this is one in industry skills, one in human-centered design for us at Beenleigh State High School. And basically the earners of this badge are able to create design solutions where human needs and wants are considered a priority, and the following criteria has been met. I won't read that all through to you, but you can basically see how it starts to give employers the opportunity to see exactly what skills our students have achieved and at what level they've actually achieved those skills. Thank you, Margot. So this is now where we get coming to the end of this presentation and where we start looking at our credit-bearing micro-credentials. Again, as Kevin alluded to before, we've started looking at this credential in digital literacy. It's obviously very important. We are already teaching this in our schools and TAFE and universities. It's ensconced within all of our curriculum and our syllabuses. So what we're hoping to do, and we've actually mapped this, digital literacies, right across every framework that exists with not only in Australia, but worldwide. Again, we know our students are going to be global citizens. And basically what we're hoping to do is basically give recognition for prior learning to our students. So if this will be accessible. If they pass that assessment at the end of grade 12, it will give them credit into TAFE. And then once they do their TAFE course, and further education, if they sit another assessment there, that will hopefully give them credit into a university course as well. So this will be Queensland's first credit-bearing micro-credential in digital literacies. Thank you, Margot. So just in conclusion from me, we actually and this is not just Australia, as I said with Harvard, and this is around the world. We need to start reimagining our K-12 education so it prepares our students for the fourth industrial revolution. These are two images here of current education classes in my school. The one on the left, we're not preparing students for the future economy. We're not preparing them for the future of work. These are other school students of mine over on the right, where we're engaging them, and this is actually a STEM lab that we actually have. And as you can see, you're encouraging those students to be engaged, you're encouraging them to be probably innovative, we're encouraging them to work collaboratively. So we need to really start reimagining what our education looks like to make sure we are preparing our students for the future of work, which is going to change dramatically over the next 5 to 10 years. Last slide, thank you, Margot. And this is just linking into Margot's presentation. So on completing their schooling, the learner profile should follow. So it's a learner, we call them a learner profile, should follow our individuals from their childhood education through to workforce, and encourage a shift in focus from those formal certificates that they're going to throw away and lose straight after school and statements to the creation of an education wallet and or passport for specific skills development and lifelong learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. That was really, really insightful and really, really interesting. Again, it's not the first time I've heard it, but every time I hear it, I learn something new and there's another dimension to it for me. Margot, I think we're going to roll straight into your presentation and then we'll take questions afterwards.
Absolutely. Lovely to be here and thank you for inviting me. What was probably not clear in the introduction, I am the co-chair with Kevin in the community of practice, the cross-sector community of practice. I also work for an ed tech company. And for that reason, I've been immersed in, I guess, the data, the underlying data, and also the notion around if we are moving forward with this new way of learning, this different way of recognizing our learning, there has to also be the yin and the yang of data to underpin it and to ensure scalability. So I'm going to talk a little bit today around that, that when we're setting our strategy from a learning perspective, that we are absolutely preparing and putting the infrastructure in place from a data perspective as well. And so we've been talking about micro-credentials, with Donna and with Kevin, and we've been talking about micro-credentials as the learning. What I want to talk about is the digital credentials, as in the digital representation of that learning. So I guess just a quick recap of why do we want digital credentials? Well, we're in the fourth industrial revolution and we're not going backwards, right? So it's digital now and it's digital into the future. I think it's also from a global perspective, but most definitely here in Australia, it's an equity consideration. That recognition of all learning and not just formal learning is important for the lifelong learning global vision. And to do that, we can only do that by embracing, encompassing, and doing an intentional design with our data. I think there's also a consideration if we're moving into digital credentialing to think about mobility. And we need to think about mobility not just from a geographic perspective, although that is certainly up for consideration, but certainly the social and economic mobility, the social mobility of, learners like in Donna's high school, right? How can they improve their social capital and improve their economic standing through recognition of learning? The other important aspect around digital credentials is this notion of learner agency, that we're empowering the learners with their learner data and that they have the choice of being able to choose who they share their learning data with, and being able to also curate their learning. And Donna made mention of that with the talk of digital wallets, and we'll get to that in a moment. The other important point around the digital and the data that underpins micro-credentials is around creating these visible learning pathways. For me, it's a very, very important notion around visibility. Are we making skills and competencies visible for learners? Are we making skills and competencies visible for employers? And are we making skills and competencies with associated tools to allow learners to talk about it? So that notion of visibility is very important. So what is a digital credential? I'm sure many of you on this call are completely across this, but just a quick recap in case you are not. We're talking about documents and envelopes, essentially, right? Where the document is the credential issued. And it equates to the paper credential that, you know, in the past we have issued. The envelope though, is a secure wrapper that we use to store and share the credential. So when we're talking about digital credentials, there's two parts to it, right? There's the information around the credential inside it, and then there's the security that's wrapped around the outside to ensure that there's trust. And alongside of that, we have, of course, all the data standards to protect and transmit and translate. I'm not talking about translate just in a language sense. I'm actually talking about it in a machine learning sense. So the digital credential, as a recap, is the recognition and representation of the learning. It's a digital recognition of the micro-credential. And so I'm also going to spend a bit of time talking about grain size. And grain size in my world talks around skill level data and why that's important to go down to the level of skills and be able to articulate skills with as much context as we possibly can when we are creating our micro-credentials, when we are creating our learning. Increasingly, the degree or the qualification is no longer the only proxy for hiring. Certainly, it's starting in Australia. It's definitely, you know, well on its way in places like Europe and the US, where hiring is not just based upon the qualification that you have. Hiring is actually based upon the skills that you have. And so it's very important now to make skills more transparent, and that alignment between academic content and careers. The focus on skill level data allows for visibility across this ecosystem, as I touched upon before. And once we have articulated and defined our skills, either through a known skills taxonomy, we can then build them up into clusters, you know, skills that go together, and then into libraries and also taxonomies. So getting down to the level of skills data is important to allow you to then build it back up in the way and make the associations and the alignments that you need. One of the ways that from a data perspective, this is being done is this notion around rich skill descriptors. Rich skill descriptors started in the US as a means from a coalition of all stakeholders within the skills ecosystem to be able to have a common language. You know, when we talk about a skill in an education context, does that mean the same thing in an employment context? You know, are we all talking the same language? And so rich skill descriptors were an attempt to provide a data schema so that we can pack as much context as we possibly can at the skill level so that humans can understand it and read it and share it. But more importantly, so machines can understand and share the skill data as we move that skills data through from education to employment and that labor market data. So rich skill descriptors, I won't spend a lot of time on, but just know that they exist and know that there's a lot of work being done by numerous groups across the globe to embed as much information as we possibly can you know, around this. And there's a source down below here in the slides, and make sure that we share that The Open Skills Network in the US is doing a lot of work around rich skill descriptors. So I'm sorry about the background noise. I do apologize. Hopefully you can't hear it as much as I can.
Can't hear anything,
So
Margot.
Really? Fabulous. Thank you. So I touched upon this before, and I'm going to reiterate this notion that when you are setting a learning architecture for your institution, your organization, and you're thinking about how and why and when you deliver your learning and in what size you're delivering your learning, there is that twin track around the digital architecture that you need to put in place to make sure that the data moves as seamlessly and frictionlessly as everything else. It's vitally important that we develop open linked data structures to allow for machine readability. And I can't stress that enough. I'm going to talk through a little bit about what that means from my context. This is what we at edX view as the digital recognition continuum. And we're talking about from on the left-hand side here, the content, the assessment, and the learner achievement data that we are creating as learners go through and are assessed. We then come from the curriculum to, I guess, the collation of what does that learner achievement data mean from a skills and competency perspective? How can we bring that together? And then how can we map it and benchmark it, perhaps against frameworks that you use, a national qualifications framework, a core skills for work framework. It could even be against industry standards. That in itself is a framework. But once we have this learner achievement data and we align it to competencies and skills, we then have to have some sort of benchmark around that. And so as we move through this continuum, we then get to how do we represent that learning for the learner? You know, how can we give them a tool that allows them to talk about their personal skills and competencies, either in a hiring situation or a further education situation, or even purely for upskilling of themselves. The last point here on this particular continuum as we outline it is, as Donna mentioned, the mobility aspect. You know, once we have this digital representation of our learning through what we create, which is a learner evidence record, but also through a digital badge, how do we store it? How do we share it? You know, what's the mechanism, you know, for learners to actually be able to curate and share that data? And that's coming in the form of all the work that's being done around digital wallets. You may also hear them called comprehensive learner records. Potentially in the US, there's a lot of work being done also on this notion of a learner employment record. Essentially, it's a digital credential exchange that allows you to safely store and curate your digital achievements and then share them to whomever you want. But it is that notion too around learner agency. The learner has control around that storage and sharing. So I've just put a few points together, just very high level around, I guess, what I call the rules or engagement for developing digital credentials. So these are things that you must think around from a data perspective when you're embarking upon your strategy. There has to be an intentional design for open data standards. And the reason for that is to promote trust, because we have all come from the good old days where, you know, we all got a certificate, we all got a paper degree, and that trust was embedded into the university or the institution that issued that credential. When you move to a data, more of an open data ecosystem, the trust is also in the issuer, but the trust also has to be embedded within the data standards themselves. So intentional design for open data standards, again, to allow that data to move. Sustainability and prevent lock-in. This is super important. If you are going to put a data strategy in place, you do not want it locked into a proprietary system where your data cannot be shared. This is vitally important for portability for the learner, to allow that learner centricity and to also allow for longevity. So, you want to future-proof your system as you're going through. Hand in glove with that is interoperability with your existing infrastructure, right? You don't want to throw out all the baby with the bathwater. You've got to have something that's going to work with your existing infrastructure. And it has to be accessible, right? That goes without saying. It has to support different issuers and types of credentials, because it's not just going to be one credential that saves them all. There are going to be different types and they all have to work together. It has to be scalable and it's got to be fault tolerant. And the last one is that you have to minimize for personally identifying information. I can't stress how important that is. And it's particularly important for cohorts like Donna is catering for, the younger generation, and particularly under 16s. There are certainly in Australia very stringent legislation around the kind of information that you're gathering. So this is just a quick, and I'm sorry for the very, very busy slide. But when we're moving into this notion of a skills ecosystem, and I need to stress again, this is an emergent ecosystem, then these are the kinds of steps that are going to have to take place from both a human and from a machine perspective. At the beginning, there's a whole bunch of work that's going to have to happen identifying skills, and there's no getting away from it. That's going to be human work. If we are truly going to be able to give visibility to learners to allow them to be lifelong learners, then this bit of the work from an organization and institution perspective is critical. We can't just talk about knowledge. We can't just tell them that they, know how to solder some steel together, right? They also have to have the tools to talk about more than that, more than just tasks and knowledge. They have to be able to dig down into, as both Donna and Kevin said, those enduring skills, those transferable skills. So there's a whole bunch of work to be done down at this end around the identification of the skills from a content perspective and from a curriculum perspective. We then need to compile those skills into some frameworks to make sense of them. We do need the scaffolding to make sense of these skills. What does that look like? And there is some existing data standards out there already that's going to help us do that. And on the final slide that I have, I've outlined a number of different bodies globally that are working very carefully in this data area. Once we have those skills compiled into frameworks, we then need the ability to make the linking, right? It's all very well to have, your skills libraries, but you need the ability to actually intentionally communicate what is learned, how it's assessed, and what's the evidence of that from a data perspective. And then we need to digitally document the achievement. How are these skills captured in a validated, verified, formal record of learning? The learner profile that Donna referenced, the digital wallet, the comprehensive learner record. And again, there's a lot of work being done in this very area, because into the future, this particular step, being able to document and share your digital achievements, is going to be, I think, the linchpin of how we move forward. And the last one here is around that cataloging, right? How do we disseminate this through the digital wallets or credential exchanges? How do we make that happen? That's not, I personally don't think that the technology is here yet to enable that, but it's pretty close. So there's a lot of work and attention being put in this particular space from the US Chamber of Commerce, from big players like IBM and Walmart in the US, they're putting a lot of money into enabling this particular stage of the skills ecosystem. And finally, I think we have the resume of the future, right? A digital resume that's a smart resume that can signal the skills that I have and can also signal to employers in a talent marketplace. So I know that's a lot of steps and it was probably a lot of information thrown at you, but there are people thinking very carefully across the globe, not just in Australia or the US. Certainly Europe are very far advanced around their Europass and the kind of information, the kind of work that they're doing around being able to digitally enable this emerging skills ecosystem. So I mentioned that there are a number of groups working, and I won't go through all of these, but just know that, in various places and for different purposes, there's a lot of collaboration going on in the world of data. And from an EDILEX perspective, where I work, we are deeply immersed in being able to enable this to happen. And so we're spending a lot of time, I guess, what I call the skills plumbing. How can we connect all the various parts of this ecosystem from an open data perspective? And I will stop there.
Thank you, Margot, and we'll shortly take questions, and I believe that Zed might be helping us to facilitate some of that. But just to sum up, and again, my thanks to yourself, Margot and Donna. Colleagues, I think you'll probably hear that all three of us said similar things in slightly different contexts, that this is an emergent international and global conversation, that it's probably more advanced in some jurisdictions than others, but it's certainly but it's very definitely a conversation that's occurring, that it's a body of work that needs to be considered from both the digital technology and the policy perspective, that it's not sufficient to just have frameworks or policies, that you really need those digital ecosystems, if you like, that can actually capture those credentials and manage and facilitate them. I mean, I made a note, data, and of course, we all of us increasingly live in a world where learning analytics and the analysis of the student's performance and the data that helps us to understand how the learner is progressing is important, and that's no less so the case in micro-credentials. And that there is also this broader sense of, if you like, flipping the paradigm of provider to a user-centric approach. And Margot briefly touched on blockchain there. And I think increasingly, as we see providers play around with technologies like blockchain, and I know that there are universities in the US who are using blockchain or trialing blockchain quite extensively. And I think, again, we're going to start to see that increasing shift away from the provider, from the power of the organization. Again, Margot talked on the importance of the quality assurance there, but I think that we'll see learners taking more responsibility in this kind of fourth industrial age, information age, or what I call the digital economy, as we move into the digital economy, and that we're increasingly seeing that it's not just sufficient to be having students and learners who are provided with knowledge, but they need that metacognitive ability to take bits of learning from different parts of the experience, parse them or connect them together and make new meaning, if you like. Hence the considerations around digital fluency as opposed to digital literacy. Zed, I think I'm happy to conclude there, and I think that we're happy to take any questions, comments, feedback, and maybe ask colleagues what resonated.
Thank you so much for the great presentations from all the speakers. We have a few questions. The first one would be, what are the key challenges in transitioning to micro-credentials?
Well, I mean, I think I might have a go at that, and then I think Donna or Margot would also have a view on that. For me, the key challenge is again, as I said, and I probably will say the same thing over and over because it's kind of what my experience has taught me are the key things. I think one is having some kind of consistent policy framework in place or framework that enables you to be clear and unambiguous about what your micro-credentials are. And we talk about micro-credentials and badges and their awards. And it's about having a framework that enables you to frame them, but then making sure that you've got in place the digital ecosystem that can enable you to deliver on them, to capture them, to curate them, and then pass around different parts of the system as you go. Donna and Margot, you've built a micro-credential framework in practice.
Yeah, the ecosystem is really important. You've actually got to, I wasn't doing that at first. I sort of launched in with the staff from our school and tried to basically build this project without really having the concept, the full concept of what we're about to start out and try and achieve. So the ecosystem is really important, but also within a school setting, within secondary education, you've got to make sure you're getting the credentials validated. So we actually use our business partners to validate those employability skills. The one thing we don't want is every school in the world creating all these non-credit bearing micro-credentials that at the end of the day mean nothing. There's so many of them out there that they actually aren't worth anything. We've got to make sure this process is worthwhile for our students and our local our employers. So I think for us, one of the real issues, make sure that they are validated.
And Margot, you manage
you.
these conversations across the country and globally.
It's true. And I just echo everything that you're saying around the why. And that why and the value for learners is incredibly important, because I still think that as this is such a nascent movement, not just around micro-credentials, but around, the digitization of them as well, that notion of trust is incredibly important. And that notion of trust is only going to be built by the quality and value that's communicated to both the learners and then also the recipients of the employers, right? That trust relationship is only going to be built around value. And the other thing I would say is scalability. We're still struggling with how this can be scaled from a quality perspective, not just across an institution, but across the country. So scalability is also something that's incredibly important and being worked on.
Great, thank you for those answers. To follow up on the previous question, how do you address these challenges, both from a K-12 and higher education perspective?
Maybe Donna, you might want to go first on this one.
In terms of, you've got to be aware too that we didn't set about in secondary education trying to turn over what we actually already do in secondary education. We're really trying to complement what we're doing and then build on, I guess, what we're actually doing. So effectively, you've got to make sure in that process that you are not burning out all your staff as well. And this would be the same with universities, it would be the same worldwide. We've got to make sure that we're not actually, but they're already very busy. Teachers in all your schools in Saudi Arabia are very, very busy. Teachers in schools in Australia and America, wherever, they're actually very busy people. So what you've got to do, we actually made sure that we had a group of people who were very interested in moving this forward, wanting to make sure that we had equity in our system, and we found that micro-credentials might offer that equity for our students. And then we had a small group of people, and then once we had that group of people that were working in this space, we relied on our early adopters, and they came on board, and we had these small teams that worked in this space. And at the time, it was at a point that we found all of our staff and many schools said, that's great, we want to come on board. That's when you actually get a lot of people, you can move it forward much quicker. But it has to start quite small with a group of early adopters. And that's how we achieve that and getting over these challenges.
Margaret, did you want to add anything to that?
Okay. In examples provided by you, how is the industry involved with academia to develop these micro-credentials?
Sorry, Zed, I just missed the end of that question. Any examples that provided how?
How is the industry involved with academia to develop these micro-credentials?
All right. Do we involve this? Is there student support in developing the micro-credentials? Was that the question? Do students help us to create them? Are they co-creators?
No, industry. How does industry?
Oh, industry. Oh, industry.
How is industry
Yeah.
involved? Yes.
Yeah, industry. Sorry. Okay. That's probably. I think there are examples in the Australian context. One that comes to mind is Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, which RMIT, which is the university in Melbourne, where they've developed micro-credentials where they did go out and seek to work very closely with industry on the design and development of their micro-credentials. I think it kind of goes back a little bit to, I think it was Margot's comment about the variability or the risk of everybody going off doing their own thing. And then at some point, how do you pull all those all together and understand how a student who's achieved a micro-credential, how does the micro-credential from one university in Australia match up to a micro-credential from another university in Australia, let alone a micro-credential from a university in Saudi Arabia versus a university micro-credential in Australia. and these are some of the challenges that we're having. But Margot, I don't know if you are aware more of that kind of industry connection, and also Donna, from your own perspective, whether that was something that you brought industry into your conversations as well. So, yeah. So Margot.
Sorry, I'll just go first, only because obviously, as I said before, schools have to have them validated by industry. It's the only way forward for us. But the other thing is TAFE. So I don't know what the equivalent of a TAFE would be. And I know you have K-12 the same as us in Saudi Arabia, but I'm not sure what the equivalent of TAFE. So TAFE is basically further education between high school and just under university, I suppose, in the sense that they offer certs and diplomas. And they connect all of their micro-credentials, TAFE Queensland, all of their micro-credentials, or most of them, are actually in line with businesses. So they get businesses on board, and the micro-credentials are to get those students straight into those businesses.
Yeah, just to reinforce that too, I think the intent behind micro-credentials was really to fill the gap, between the perception of graduates coming out of, institutions not having the job ready skills that are required. And so you can't do that in isolation, right? It has to be a co-creation process with industry. Because again, echoing back to the value of micro-credentials, that value is going to be embedded in the skills level, the skills outcomes. So yeah, you can't do it without co-creation with industry. I just don't think it's really going to be, I just don't think the value is going to be there for learners. And eventually I don't think the value is going to be there from an industry perspective either.
To touch back on something that you've discussed, which is lifelong learning. How do you see the micro-credentials help learners achieve their lifelong learning seamlessly?
This is an interesting conversation, I think, Zed, and this This is part of that understanding of what are micro-credentials, and at one end of the equation, if you use the European standard definition of a micro-credential, you're talking about, I think it's 100 to 150 hours of learning, which is the equivalent, and this probably goes back a little bit to the question in the Q&A, which is the equivalent to what we would consider to be a unit of a broader course at university. So, under that definition, each of our individual units could be considered, in theory, to be a micro-credential. But then, if you look at the other extreme, you might be awarding badges that are not assessed at all and just cover very discrete components of what it is you do. I think, again, to me, this is where there needs to be that mapping and that thinking that you can't just jump into saying. I was challenged in a previous university by a provost who asked me to develop a micro-credential framework for the university, and they wanted it done in a month. And what that told me, and what I increasingly found to be the case, was that in challenging me to develop a micro-credential framework in a month, they actually didn't really know what a micro-credential framework was and what it was they wanted, because as with all things educational, it's complex. And education is a complex endeavor that sits in, quite rightly, in a complex ecosystem of curriculum and syllabus. And the onus, part of our role as educational providers, is that we quality assure that curriculum and that syllabus, irrespective of modes of delivery, because ultimately we're responsible for assuring that a nurse who qualifies is capable of being a nurse, or a teacher is capable of being a teacher. And so what for me, and I go back to my original question that I posed, it's about how you think about micro-credentials as part of that bigger curriculum ecosystem, if you like. And maybe Donna touched on our TAFE system and certificates, and maybe what we need to be doing is thinking about how micro-credentials nest into certificates, nest into diplomas, nest into undergraduate degrees, nest into graduate diplomas, graduate certificates, graduate diplomas, and master's degrees. And I don't think that we've really done that work to think about them, contextualize them as part of that much broader ecosystem. They exist over here as the other. And until we can work out how they fit into the broader, I think we're going to struggle. And this is a very long-winded answer, I know, but if I go back to my original comment about how does a micro-credential from a Saudi Arabian university stack up to a micro-credential from an Australian university, we don't know. But we do know that a 3 or 4 year bachelor's degree earned at a Saudi Arabian university, we do know how to map that to somebody arriving in Australia seeking to undertake a master's degree on the basis of that bachelor's degree. So I think we have to think about how it fits in that broader context.
Perfect. Dr. Harvey, Ms. Griffith, do you have anything to add to that?
Just, I suppose, in the sense that from a K-12 schooling perspective, the micro-credentials actually offer like short-term goal setting for our students, I suppose. So, faced with having to go to university and do a 4-year degree, some of my students will go, no, I'm not interested in that. But if they've got, they're like stepping stones, I suppose. So I have an interest in this area, I'll do a micro-credential, and then once we make them stackable, the thing we don't have at the moment, as Kevin just alluded to, they're not stackable. Once we start we recognize that prior learning and make them stackable, that's when it starts to really engage my students in those socioeconomic areas and leads to that, lifelong learning, I think, or, learning to learn.
Perfect. Do you currently see rigid policy frameworks are per se hindrance for enabling such innovative approaches?
I think this is actually one for Margot, because Margot has worked very closely in Australia at the national level, where we have actually got a fairly light touch framework in place, haven't we, Margot?
We do indeed. And I was smiling then when you asked that question, Zed, because it's a constant source of debate in the country at the moment. You know, we recognize and acknowledge that we need the frameworks. We do need the scaffolding to embed that meaning and trust, right? But it also, the flip side of that is the constraints around rigid frameworks and how that, I guess, impedes innovation. I'd also like to make the point that with regards to micro-credentials, we spent most of this webinar talking about micro-credentials within a formal learning setting, but there's a place for micro-credentials to recognize and represent non-formal learning or even informal learning. And I think that's the beauty of where this movement is going, that micro-credentials don't necessarily just have to be constructs within formal education, right? Because if we start to broaden our conversation around qualifications and degrees and what those proxies are for what we know, and we broaden it to say a skills level discussion to say, well, I may not have the formal education or the formal training, and I may not have been allowed to do that formal education. I might not have the opportunity to have done it. Doesn't mean I don't have skills, and it doesn't mean those skills can't be recognized. So I think we have to, and we have the opportunity now with micro-credentials, with the representation, the digital representation of that, to broaden our remit away from just learning in a formal construct to non-formal and informal learning. And I think that's going to also be what springboards this lifelong learning vision globally, truly. I believe that that's what's going to be needed. That was also a long-winded answer, sorry.
Great answer, thank you. Anything to add from that, Dr. Harvey or Professor Ashford?
No, so when I say no, I actually turns out I mean yes. Or all I would say is that I think that Margot is right. That I mean, I, as an educator, tend to think about and understand that kind of curriculum context in the more formal sense. But yes, there is an organic micro-credentialing movement that is going to generate up these smaller, discrete parts of skills or knowledge or attributes, whatever they are. And I think that the challenge somewhere is going to be how we integrate one into the other, or how we understand the value of both as they exist in fish that swim in two separate ponds.
Great.
Sorry, just to add a little bit more to that and some context is, I always come back to learning environments like Scouts or Duke of Edinburgh or Surf Life Saving Australia or the Red Cross, right? Lots of wonderful, rich learning that has happened in a structured but non-formal way. And, you know, we have the opportunity to build the pathways for those recipients of that learning into more formal learning pathways if they wish, right? You know, so I do think that it's beholden upon all of us on this call to sort of broaden, you know, our construct of learning away from just formal.
All said.
A question came into my mind. What is your strategy to integrate the curriculum into a bite size like micro-credential?
So you know what, when I think about this, I'm not actually sure that I want to disaggregate the curriculum into bite-sized modules. And I'm deeply challenged and conflicted here as an educator who has built a career on designing and developing curated, expert designed offerings that take somebody, as I said at the outset, from first year undergraduate to third or fourth year graduate, nurse or teacher or whatever it may be. I've long, in the Australian higher education curriculum context, curriculum design is predicated on learning outcomes, and then a constructive alignment between a learning outcome and an assessment. It struck me a long time ago that if you were seriously wanting to disaggregate the Australian higher education curriculum context, then probably an individual learning outcome, you might want to view that as a micro credential or a component. We have units that are may contain 4, 5, 6 learning outcomes. Again, as I said, in the European standard, what we consider to be a unit is what they would describe as a micro credential, which is part of that challenge. If someone put a gun to my head and said to me, you have to disaggregate your curriculum down to the lowest level, then I would say, well, then let's start with individual learning outcomes, create them as all individual entities with constructively aligned assessments, and then work out how we rebuild them. But I'm not comfortable with that answer, and I'm not necessarily comfortable with that approach, because I don't know that that there isn't going to continue to be a place for universities and the constructed courses, because when you think about it, often people come to education because they don't know, and what they're paying for is the experts to design the offerings that enable them to get to where they want to get to. And I worry about someone who's thrown a smorgasbord or a chocolate box full of individual chocolates and told to construct a meal.
If I could just jump in with an answer there as well, from a broader sense, got to be very careful around why we're constructing micro credentials, right? That why is the North Star. So there are many, I suppose, ways why you would disaggregate some curriculum. And the one that comes to mind is an equity issue, to provide more flexibility for the learner who needs either an entry point or an exit point from their learning, with some sort of recognition that they have done some learning. And by that, I mean, at the moment, when we go in and we are getting a degree, the university or the institution is almost holding that learning hostage until you've completed your 4 years, right? So there is a place for a credential as you go strategy that allows an entry point and an exit point for learners if they need to do life. And by that, I mean, if you have to leave perhaps your degree and go and take care of your mum or something like that, right? Being able to recognize that learning and take part of your learning with you is going to be vitally important. So I see that there is definitely a place for an equity play here. The other point around micro-credentials is, why are we doing them? And usually we are doing them to augment an already existing curriculum or program with maybe more professional skills. And so the professionalization of the curriculum, I think, leads itself beautifully to micro-credentials. Perhaps you can have a micro-credential in project management that can be embedded both in the business faculty and also in the engineering faculty, right? So it allows some more flexibility within your programming. It allows for cost efficiencies in your product development, but it also allows and enables the learner to have that flexibility to have their learning recognized at discrete points across, their learning journey. So,
and said,
again, another long-winded answer.
What you've just heard there in microcosm is one of the reasons why our Queensland micro-credential community of practice is a genuine community of practice and is vibrant, because these we have this range of views present, and we debate these very topics and ask each other these questions. And as we listen to each other's responses, it helps to shape all of our thinking.
Great, wonderful answer. I believe this concludes our Q&A session. A link to the webinar survey has been provided in the chat. We kindly ask the participants to complete it within 10 minutes after the end of the session. Tune in next time, Wednesday, October 12th at 11 a.m. Arabian Standard Time for the second session of this webinar, where we will be discussing the industry perspective of stackable micro-credentials. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center, we thank our distinguished host, Professor Kevin Ashford-Rowe, for leading this interactive and informative webinar on stackable micro-credentials in K-12 and higher education. We'd also like to thank the esteemed panelists, Dr. Donna Harvey and Ms. Margot Griffith, for their valuable input, and of course, the participants for attending this webinar. Until next time, I'm Zaid Al-Ragib. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.